Vivid verses.
The shift in our living arrangement didn't happen with a single explosion or a grand betrayal. It was a slow, calculated reorganization of reality that Hannah began about 18 months ago. You know what I do for a living? I audit supply chains for manufacturing firms. My entire day is spent identifying where a process fails, where a delivery is delayed, and who is responsible for the bottleneck. I deal with numbers, freight manifests, and contracts. There is no room for ambiguity when a shipment of specialized alloy is sitting in a warehouse in Singapore because someone forgot to sign a customs declaration. I applied that same structural logic to our relationship when we moved into the place on 4th Street. We had a clear division of labor. I handled the mortgage, the insurance, and the long-term capital improvements. Hannah was responsible for the monthly utilities and the grocery rotation. It was a balanced system based on our respective income levels and the time I spent traveling for work. For the first 2 years, the system functioned. The lights stayed on, the fridge was full, and the house operated with the efficiency of a well-managed plant. The change started with her phone. She began spending 4 to 6 hours a day scrolling through short-form videos featuring people in soft lighting, using clinical terminology to describe everyday social friction. She wasn't just consuming this content. She was adopting it as a defensive architecture. She began to replace standard English with a vocabulary designed to insulate her from any form of criticism or accountability. The first time I saw the new system in action was over a missed dinner reservation with my brother and his wife. We'd had it on the calendar for 3 weeks. I'd sent her a reminder text at noon that day. When I got home at 6:30 p.m., she was on the couch, still in her pajamas, watching a video about identifying covert narcissism. When I asked why she wasn't ready, she didn't apologize. She didn't offer an excuse about losing track of time. Instead, she informed me that my expectation of her being ready by 6:45 p.m. was a form of linear temporal pressure that was triggering her rejection sensitivity. She told me that by reminding her of the dinner, I was encroaching on her regulated state and that she needed to prioritize her capacity for the evening. In my world, if a supplier tells me they didn't ship the parts because they needed to prioritize their capacity, I cancel the contract. In a relationship, it's not that simple. I try to explain that my brother had made the reservation weeks in advance and that we were now going to be the reason for a 4-person cancellation fee. She told me that my focus on the financial penalty was a distraction from the emotional harm I was causing by not holding space for her struggle. That was the template for the next year. Every failure to perform a basic adult task was rebranded as a mental health symptom. If the laundry sat in the washer until it smelled like mildew, it wasn't because she forgot. It was executive dysfunction. If she spent $300 on vintage clothes when we were supposed to be saving for a new furnace, it was dopamine seeking to combat a depressive episode. She began weaponizing terms like gaslighting whenever I pointed out a discrepancy in her narrative. If I said, "You told me you'd call the plumber today," and she hadn't, she would respond with, "You're gaslighting me into believing that my worth is tied to my productivity." She was using the language of therapy to bypass the requirements of partnership. The situation became critical in July. I had been in the field for a week, auditing a textile mill in South Carolina. It was 95 degrees every day, and the humidity was thick enough to feel like a physical weight. I arrived home on a Tuesday evening, exhausted and looking forward to a cold shower and the central air. I pulled into the driveway and noticed the house was dark. Not just no lights on dark, but dead on the grid dark. The smart doorbell didn't chime. The porch light was off. I walked into the kitchen and found Hannah sitting at the table in the shadows. The house was easily 85 degrees and climbing. I asked her if the power had gone out in the whole neighborhood. She didn't look up from her phone. She told me the energy of the house felt heavy, and she was journaling through a breakthrough. I checked the breaker box in the pantry. Everything was engaged. I walked outside to the meter. The digital display was blank, a clear sign of a remote disconnect from the utility provider. I called the power company on my cell. The automated system informed me that the account was 92 days past due. 3 separate urgent notices had been mailed. The service had been terminated for non-payment. I paid the balance, the late fees, and the reconnection penalty, $842 total, just to get the HVAC to hum back to life. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "Hannah," I said, "the bill hasn't been paid since April." "Why?" She looked at me then, but her eyes were cold, filled with the practiced defiance of someone who had already rehearsed their defense. She told me that her anxiety regarding financial scarcity had been peaking for months. She said that every time she looked at the billing portal, she felt a freeze response, and that by not noticing her struggle, I had failed to provide a soft landing. She actually told me that my stony silence was a form of emotional withholding that made it impossible for her to be honest about the bills. "Forgetting the electric bill for 3 months isn't a trauma response, Hannah," I said. "It's negligence. I'm not a narcissist for expecting you to do what you said you would do when we signed the lease. The power company doesn't care about your nervous system. They care about the balance." She started to cry, the kind of crying that involved a lot of noise, but no actual moisture. She told me I was triggering her and that I was weaponizing facts to make her feel small. "If paying a bill triggers you," I told her, "then you shouldn't be in charge of them. From now on, I'm taking over all the accounts. I'm changing the passwords. You won't have access to the joint checking because you've demonstrated that you can't manage the outflow without letting the system collapse." She looked at me with genuine shock. "You're financially abusing me," she said. "You're isolating me from our resources." "No," I said. "I'm accommodating your anxiety. You said the bills make you feel unsafe. I am removing the source of your lack of safety. I'm creating the safe space you asked for by removing the responsibility you can't handle. It's a logistical correction." I spent the next hour at my desk. I changed every password, unlinked her email from the utility accounts, and moved the remaining household funds into an account she couldn't touch. I did it with the same clinical efficiency I use when I'm cutting a vendor who consistently delivers substandard parts. It wasn't about anger. It was about risk mitigation. The next 2 weeks were silent. I went to work every day, dealing with a dock strike in Long Beach that was holding up $5 million in electronic components. I spent my hours calculating lead times and negotiating with freight forwarders. When I came home, I cooked dinner for myself and left a portion for her in the fridge. I didn't engage when she tried to start processing sessions about my need for control. Whenever she'd start with, "I feel like we need to unpack your inability to empathize with my neurodivergence," I'd just look at her and say, "The lights are on, Hannah. That's the only outcome I'm interested in right now." That's when she brought in the reinforcements. Her parents, Bill and Martha, called me on a Friday. They're the kind of people who have spent 30 years shielding Hannah from the friction of the real world. They think every problem can be solved with a conversation and a check. Bill started the call by saying he was concerned about the power dynamic in our house. Martha said she was worried that I was being too rigid and that Hannah felt like she was walking on eggshells. "She's crying every time we talk to her, Gabe," Bill said. "She says you've cut her off. That's not how a partnership works." I took over the bills because she didn't pay them for 90 days. I told them. "We spent 48 hours without power in July. Did she tell you that?" There was a long pause. I could hear Martha whispering in the background. "She said she had some trouble with the website," Martha said. "She's very sensitive to technology, Gabe." "She didn't have trouble with the website," I said. "She chose not to look at it because it made her feel anxious. I am managing her anxiety for her by taking the task off her plate. Isn't that what you've always done for her? Handle the hard parts, so she doesn't have to. You're being very cold, son, Bill said. A marriage, or a relationship like yours, needs more than just math. It needs grace. Grace doesn't keep the refrigerator running, Bill. And a relationship is a contract. She defaulted. I'm restructuring. If she wants to be treated like an equal partner, she has to act like one. You can't demand the status of an adult while maintaining the responsibilities of a child. I hung up. I didn't feel bad about it. I felt like I was watching a machine break down because the operator refused to oil the gears. That night, Hannah confronted me in the kitchen. She had her phone out, propped up against a bowl of fruit. I realized later she was probably recording the interaction for her support group or her social media feed. She was using her gentle voice, the one she used when she was trying to bait me into a reaction she could label as toxic. Gabriel, she said, I've been speaking with my circle, and we agree that your refusal to engage in emotional processing is a form of stonewalling. It's a classic narcissistic tactic. I need you to acknowledge the harm you've caused by taking away my financial agency. I was eating a sandwich. I didn't put it down. I looked at the phone, then back at her. I didn't take your agency, I said. You surrendered it when you stopped paying the bills. Agency requires action. You chose an action. I am simply acknowledging the reality of the situation. You're being so clinical, she said, her voice starting to tremble. Where is the love? Where is the empathy for what I'm going through? Empathy doesn't pay the Edison bill, Hannah, and love isn't a license to be useless. You spent the last 6 months learning how to be a professional victim. You've replaced your personality with a list of symptoms and your responsibilities with a list of triggers. I'm not interested in being the villain in the script you're writing for your followers. She looked at me, and for a second, the gentle mask slipped. The therapy voice disappeared, replaced by genuine, raw frustration. She couldn't find the words because the jargon wasn't working. I wasn't getting defensive, and I wasn't apologizing. I was just stating facts. You're a monster, she hissed. No, I said. I'm a guy who kept the air conditioning on. There's a difference. I realized then that the relationship had reached a point of total systems failure. We no longer shared a common language. She was living in a world of subjective vibes and curated trauma, and I was living in a world of objective results. You can't build a life with someone who uses their mental health as a weapon to avoid the basic requirements of existence. It's like trying to run a factory where the floor manager refuses to look at the safety reports because they don't align with their truth. I spent the next week preparing the exit. I didn't tell her. I just handled the logistics. I looked at the lease. We were month to month. I called the landlord and told him I'd be vacating at the end of the next month. I found a smaller apartment closer to the rail yards. It was a one-bedroom, concrete floors, very minimal. I liked it. It was predictable. I began moving my things out in small increments. I take a box of books to the office, then to the new place. I took my tools. I took the good kitchen knives. She didn't notice because she was too busy documenting her healing journey. I saw a post of hers, a picture of a candle with a caption about divorcing yourself from people who don't support your expansion. On the final day, I hired a crew to take the furniture that belonged to me, the sofa, the bed, the dining table. I sat on the one remaining folding chair while they worked. Hannah came out of the bedroom, frantic, her phone in her hand as she recorded the movers. What is this? She demanded. You can't just leave. This is abandonment. This is a blindside. It's a form of emotional violence. I stood up and handed her an envelope. It contained a check for her half of the security deposit, a copy of the lease termination notice I'd sent 30 days prior, and a list of the login information for the utility accounts, which I had transferred back in her name. It's not a blindside, I said. I've been telling you for months that this wasn't working. You just categorize my warnings as criticism and toxicity so you wouldn't have to listen to them. This is the natural consequence of your choices. I have nowhere to go, she screamed. She wasn't using the therapy voice anymore. She was just a person who had realized the safety net was gone. You have your parents, I said, and you have your circle. Maybe they can hold space for you while you find a job. I've paid the rent through the end of the month. You have 30 days to figure out your next move. She started into another monologue, something about my lack of accountability and how I would never find peace because I hadn't healed my masculine core. I picked up my laptop bag and walked to the door. I stopped and looked back at her. She was standing in the middle of an empty room, holding her phone like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Hannah, I said, do yourself a favor. In your next relationship, try being an adult. It's a lot more effective than being a patient. I walked out. I didn't check my phone when it started buzzing in my pocket. I knew it was her, or Bill, or Martha, or some friend she'd convinced I was a monster. I didn't care. I got into my truck and drove to the new place. The new apartment was quiet. The logistics were perfect. I sat on my new sofa and looked at my bank account. The numbers were where they were supposed to be. The lights were on. The water was running. The air was cool. I had a shipment of industrial valves coming into the port the next morning at 0600. I needed to be sharp. I set my alarm, put my phone on Do Not Disturb, and went to sleep. The system was finally back in balance. Thinking back on it now, explaining it to you like this, I realize how much energy I was wasting trying to maintain a structure that she was actively dismantling from the inside. It's like trying to keep a roof on a house while the person inside is selling the rafters for firewood. You can't audit someone into being a partner. They either show up for the job or they don't. She didn't, so I closed the account. Simple as that. The most interesting thing is seeing the fallout on social media. A friend sent me a link to her latest video. She's talking about surviving a high-control environment. She's got 20,000 likes. People are commenting about how brave she is. It's fascinating, really. She's managed to turn her inability to pay an electric bill into a narrative of heroic survival. But here's the thing, the comments don't pay the rent. And eventually, her parents are going to get tired of paying for her expansion. I'm glad I'm not the one who has to be there when the lights go out next time. I've got my own grid to manage. I've got my own shipments to track. And for the first time in years, the math actually adds up. I don't hate her. Hate is a high-energy emotion that requires a lot of maintenance. I just view her as a failed investment. I learned what I needed to learn, I took the loss, and I moved on to a more stable market. That's how you survive in this business. That's how you stay sane. Anyway, that's the story. No drama, no screaming matches, just a clean break based on the data. I'm heading out to the port now. The 0600 shipment doesn't wait for anyone's internal rhythm. It arrives when it arrives, and you either have the trucks ready or you don't. I have the trucks ready. I always do.
Thanks for listening.